They called them barbarians. The same people who burned monasteries also wrote poetry sophisticated enough to still be studied in universities today. They raided the coast of England and helped build the settlement that became Dublin. They served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, the most powerful ruler in the Christian world. They established trade routes stretching from the frozen shores of Scandinavia all the way to Baghdad. And 500 years before Columbus, one of them stood on the coast of North America, looked inland at a forest no European had ever seen, and decided to make camp. The word Viking did not mean what modern audiences usually think it means. The horned war helmets of popular imagination are a myth, and the story of how a relatively small population living on the northern edge of Europe reshaped the medieval world is stranger, more human, and more consequential than most tellings have been willing to show. Here is what most people get wrong. They imagine a single type of person, a large man with an axe, arriving without warning, destroying everything in sight, and vanishing back into the sea. That image is not entirely false, but describing the Viking Age through that image alone is like describing the ocean by pointing at a single wave. The real story is a civilization, one that produced warriors. Yes, but also poets, lawyers, merchants, explorers, engineers, and political thinkers whose experiments in self-governance are still functioning today. A civilization that operated across multiple continents and left traces so deep in the world you currently inhabit that you carry pieces of it every single day without knowing it. This is the entire history of the Viking Age. It does not begin with a raid. It begins with a world that made the raid inevitable. Chapter 1. Before the Vikings, the world that made them. Picture a winter in Scandinavia, sometime around the year 700 of the Common Era. Not the Scandinavia of modern imagination, with its glass and steel and social democracies. The Scandinavia of 12 centuries ago. Dense forest pressing down to the water's edge. Fjords cutting so deep into the coastline that the sea feels less like a border and more like a presence. Something that exists inside the land as much as around it. A sky that in December barely lifts above the southern horizon before sinking again, leaving communities in a half-light that is neither day nor night, but something in between. By almost every external measure, this is nowhere. The great civilizations of the world in the year 700 are elsewhere. The Abbasid Caliphate is building one of the most sophisticated intellectual and commercial cultures in human history in Baghdad. The Tang dynasty in China is at the height of a cultural flowering that produces art, poetry, and technological innovation of the highest order. In Western Europe, the Frankish kingdom is consolidating into the Carolingian Empire, the most organized political force the continent has seen since Rome. Scandinavia is none of these things. It is cold, fragmented, and almost entirely invisible to the writers and record keepers busy documenting the histories of more consequential places. And yet, within 100 years, Scandinavian raiders will have terrorized coastlines from Ireland to the Caspian Sea. Within 200 years, their descendants will occupy thrones from England to Sicily. Within 300 years, one of their own will build a camp on the coast of a continent that the rest of the world does not yet know exists. To understand how that happens, you have to start not with violence, but with geography. Because the Viking Age did not begin in a person's heart or a chieftain's ambition, it began in the shape of the land itself. Scandinavia is not a hospitable place to build a civilization in the agricultural sense that sustained every other great culture of the ancient world. The terrain is dominated by mountains, dense forest, and coastline. The fraction of land genuinely suitable for the kind of flat, fertile, consistent cultivation that feeds a growing population is small. Scholars studying Scandinavian environmental history have described this fraction as relatively modest, far below what comparable landmasses in Western Europe could offer. And in a pre-industrial world, farmland is not just wealth. It is survival. It determines how many children a family can feed, how large a community can grow, and what options a young man has when he comes of age and looks at what his father can leave him. Now add the fact that Scandinavia's population was expanding in the 7th and 8th centuries. The archaeological record of settlement patterns, burial sites, and land use shows communities pressing against the limits of what the available land could support. We do not have precise numbers, and any historian who gives you exact population figures for pre-Viking Scandinavia is extrapolating beyond what the evidence reliably supports. But the pattern is clear enough. More people, limited farmland, and a social structure in which inheritance flowed from father to eldest son, leaving younger sons to find their own way in a world that had not saved them a place. This is the pressure, not dramatic, not visible, not the kind of thing that makes for good television. The slow, structural kind of pressure that builds across generations and eventually forces a society toward choices it would not otherwise make. And all around this pressured, crowded, land-hungry society, there was the sea. This is the detail that separates Scandinavia from other land-pressured societies in European history. The Scandinavian coastline, measured in full, including all the fjords and inlets, is among the longest in the world relative to the landmass it belongs to. And for people who had lived alongside that coastline for generations, the sea was not a boundary. It was not an obstacle. It was a road, the only road that went somewhere genuinely new. Norse sailors had been using that road for a long time before the Viking Age began. The tradition of boat building in Scandinavia stretches back thousands of years before the first recorded raid, and the accumulated knowledge of currents, tides, winds, and seasonal patterns represented a form of navigational intelligence already sophisticated by the late 8th century. What changed was not that Scandinavians discovered the sea. What changed was what they built to sail on it. But before the ships, one more layer of this world needs to be understood. Because geography and population pressure explain the motivation, they do not explain why it worked as well as it did, or why the rest of Europe was so unprepared for what was coming. Look at what surrounded Scandinavia in the year 700. To the south and west lay the Frankish kingdom, accumulating wealth in its monasteries and churches at a rate that had no parallel in the northern world. These institutions were, from a purely strategic perspective, almost perfectly designed to be raided. They were located on coastlines and riverbanks, accessible by water. They were rich with gold, silver, and portable luxury objects accumulated over generations of pious donation. They were staffed by men who had taken vows of nonviolence, and they were protected by the theological conviction of their society that attacking them was the worst possible sin. A conviction that functioned as a deterrent only against people who shared that theological framework. The Norse did not share it, but the Norse were not simply a mass of desperate farmers looking for something to steal. The society that produced the Viking Age was already structured and hierarchical, already operating with its own internal logic about wealth, status, and what a life well lived required. At the top were the Jarls, the noble class who controlled land and commanded loyalty. Below them were the Carls, the free farmers and craftspeople who formed the productive backbone of Norse communities. And below them were the thralls, enslaved people whose existence at the foundation of the economy is a dimension of this story that honest history cannot minimize. Slavery was not peripheral to the Norse world. It was central to it. And the capture and sale of human beings would become one of the most profitable activities of the Viking Age. The point here is that the Viking Age was not driven primarily by desperation. It was driven substantially by ambition, by younger sons who would not inherit land, by men of lower noble status who understood that the fastest path to the wealth and reputation their culture valued most was not to farm more efficiently, but to go somewhere else and take what was there. By leaders who grasped with clear-eyed pragmatism that the world beyond the sea was full of things worth reaching for. And then there was the matter of how the Norse understood their own lives within the world they inhabited. The Norse did not approach existence with the Christian framework of eternal judgment and moral account-keeping that shaped the psychology of everyone they would encounter beyond their shores. They approached it through a tradition that understood fate as fixed, the broad outlines of your story already written, the manner of your death already determined. What you controlled was not the outcome. What you controlled was the quality of how you faced it, the courage you showed, the deeds you accomplished, the reputation you left behind. Because reputation was the only form of immortality the tradition reliably offered. In a culture built around these values, the calculus around risk looks completely different than it does for someone raised to believe that the meek will inherit the earth. A young Norseman standing on a beach in the late 800s, weighing the danger of a raid against the wealth and status it could bring, was not making a decision his society would call reckless. He was making a decision that, if it succeeded, would earn him exactly what his world said a life was for. None of this excuses what the raids did to the people on the receiving end of them. The violence was real. The terror was real. The suffering of coastal communities in Ireland, England, and Francia was absolutely real. And we will not paper over it. But history is not served by treating the people who made it as monsters acting without comprehensible motivation. The Viking Age emerged from a specific combination of geography, demography, social structure, and worldview that produced, when combined with a particular technological breakthrough, one of the most consequential explosions of human energy in the medieval period. That technological breakthrough was already being perfected in the boatyards of coastal Scandinavia while the monks of Lindisfarne were going about their quiet, scholarly, entirely unsuspecting lives. Chapter 2. The Longship, the technology that changed everything. In 1904, workers excavating a burial mound on a farm called Oseberg in southern Norway broke through the soil and found the prow of a ship. What emerged over the following weeks of careful excavation was a vessel approximately 21 meters long, built from oak planks so precisely shaped and fitted that the joins between them were still nearly watertight after more than 1,000 years in the ground. Its prow curved upward into a spiral of interlaced animal carvings so technically complex that modern woodcarvers who have attempted to replicate the work describe it as being at the absolute limit of what is possible with hand tools. It had been buried in the year 834 as the final resting place of two high-status women whose identities scholars still debate. It is now in Oslo, in a museum built specifically to house it. And if you stand in front of it, you understand immediately. in a way that no description quite prepares you for. That you are looking at something made by people who understood exactly what they were doing. The Oseberg ship is not even the most technically impressive Viking Age vessel we have found. That distinction likely belongs to the Gokstad ship, discovered in 1880 at a farm on the western shore of the Oslo Fjord. The Gokstad ship was a working vessel, 23 meters long, built for open ocean sailing rather than ceremonial burial. When a full-scale replica of it was sailed across the Atlantic Ocean in 1893 to attend the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, it completed the crossing in 28 days. Contemporary accounts of the crossing recorded that experienced sailors who observed the vessel were impressed by its performance in conditions that tested it fully. For a ship designed and built using 9th century methods and materials, what that replica demonstrated on the open Atlantic was not what most people expected. To understand what the Longship represented in its own time, you need to understand what every other ship in the 8th century world looked like. European vessels of this period were, with some exceptions, heavy, deep-hulled, and designed primarily for cargo transport between established ports. They needed harbors. They needed docks. They needed calm water or predictable conditions. They were instruments of commerce built around the assumption that you would arrive somewhere that was expecting you, with infrastructure prepared for your arrival. The Longship violated every one of those assumptions simultaneously. It was built using a technique modern shipbuilders call clinker construction, in which the planks of the hull overlapped each other like the scales of a fish and were riveted together rather than placed edge to edge. This gave the hull a flexibility that solid planked ships could not approach. In rough water, a clinker-built hull does not resist the movement of the sea. It moves with it, bending and flexing in response to waves in a way that distributes stress across the entire structure rather than concentrating it at fixed points. Sailors who have worked on reconstructed Viking vessels describe the experience as unlike anything else. The hull alive beneath them, responsive in ways that feel counterintuitive but are profoundly effective. The result was a ship that could survive the open North Atlantic and then, without stopping, without finding a harbor or a dock, sail directly up a river, run itself onto a beach, and deliver its crew to a point that no ship-dependent military force had ever needed to defend before. That last quality was the one that changed history. The shallow draft of the Longship, the distance between the waterline and the bottom of the hull, was in many designs less than 1 meter. This meant that Viking ships could navigate rivers that were completely inaccessible to any other ocean-going vessel. They could sail up the Thames, up the Seine, up the Loire, up the Volga and the Dnieper into the heart of Eastern Europe. They could appear, suddenly and with no warning, hundreds of miles from open water, at places that had organized their entire defensive thinking around the assumption that the sea was far away. Picture what that felt like from the other side. You are a monk or a farmer or a merchant in the Frankish interior, somewhere along the Loire Valley. In the early 900s, the nearest coastline is 200 miles away. You have never needed to think about attacks from the sea because no ship has ever been able to reach you. And then one morning you look down at the river that runs past your community and there are ships on it, coming toward you, with men standing in them who have axes. There is no framework for this. There is no word in your vocabulary for what is happening. The sea was far away, and yet here they are. The psychological impact of this was as significant as the military impact. Speed, shallow draft, ocean capability, river capability. and the ability to beach directly onto any flat shore without needing a port or a dock. No other vessel in the 8th or 9th century possessed all of these qualities simultaneously. The Longship was not simply a better ship than what its contemporaries were building. It was a different category of technology entirely. The names that survive in the Norse sources for famous ships tell you something about how deeply the culture had internalized the ships as extensions of identity. Long Serpent, Raven of the Wind, Short Serpent. These were not tools given functional designations. They were understood through language usually reserved for living things, treated with a reverence that reflects a culture which knew, at some level, that the ships were not just how they traveled. The ships were why everything else was possible. What produced this technology was not a single inventor or a single moment of inspiration. It was a tradition of boat building refined along the Scandinavian coastline for centuries by craftsmen whose names we will never know, solving problems of wood and water and wind one generation at a time. What the builders of the late 8th century did was take that tradition to a new level of scale and capability, producing vessels that could sustain long ocean passages while still performing everything the shallow draft river ship needed to do. Without the Longship, there is no Viking Age. The population pressure was real. The social ambition was real. The warrior culture and the religious framework that made risk not just acceptable but admirable were all real. But without a vessel capable of translating all of that energy across the water and up the rivers and onto the beaches of a world that had never needed to defend against it, Scandinavia remains what the rest of the world assumed it was in the year 700. A cold, peripheral place that history was happening around, but not through. On the 8th of June, 793, the world found out what the ships could do. Chapter 3. The First Raid and the Century of Fire. The monks of Lindisfarne had seen ships before. The small tidal island off the northeast coast of what is now England was not isolated from the world. Pilgrims came to it by boat. Traders passed along the coast within sight of its shores. The sea was familiar, not threatening, a road that brought people and goods and news from elsewhere. So when ships appeared off the coast on the 8th of June, 793, there was probably a moment, however brief, before anyone understood that this was different, that these ships were not coming to trade, that the men in them were not pilgrims. What happened on Lindisfarne that day was recorded by multiple sources, which is unusual for an event of this period and tells you something about the scale of the shock it produced. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle noted it. Letters written in the immediate aftermath by scholars across the continent described it, and Alcuin of York, one of the most learned men in Europe and a close advisor to Charlemagne himself, wrote a letter that has survived to the present day in which he described what happened in terms that convey something close to existential panic. Alcuin wrote that never before had such terror appeared in Britain as that which came from a pagan race. Churches were destroyed. The altar was desecrated. Some monks were killed. Others were taken to the ships. And still others fled into the sea in their panic and drowned. Now, before we accept Alcuin's account entirely at face value, we need to pause. Alcuin was a churchman writing about an attack on a church. He was not a neutral observer, and he was not writing a dispassionate historical record. The letter served purposes beyond documentation, including an argument for greater royal and ecclesiastical support for the English Church. Letters designed to secure political backing are not always the most measured accounts of events they describe. This is not a minor point. It is the central methodological challenge of the entire Viking Age as a historical subject. Almost everything the medieval written record preserved about Norse raiders was written by the people they raided, filtered through the terror of the experience, shaped by the theological framework of a church that interpreted the attackers as instruments of divine punishment. The monks were not lying. They were describing a genuine catastrophe through a lens we need to consciously hold at a distance. With that acknowledged, what can we say with confidence? The raid on Lindisfarne was almost certainly as violent as the sources describe. What is less reliable is the interpretive framework imposed on it. The idea that it came from nowhere, that it was unprecedented, that it represented the arrival of pure evil in a peaceful Christian world. Norse sailors had been known in the North Sea before 793. What Lindisfarne represented was not the absolute first contact, but the first contact of sufficient scale and violence to penetrate the written record with lasting force. Why Lindisfarne? The answer requires no complicated theory. The island was accessible by sea. Its community had accumulated over a century and a half of pious donation, a concentration of gold, silver, and portable luxury objects representing an extraordinary return for a single raid. Its defenders were unarmed men committed by vocation to nonviolence. The cultural protection it enjoyed, the theological conviction of the Christian world that attacking a holy site was unthinkable, meant nothing to men who did not share that theology. From a purely operational perspective, Lindisfarne was nearly an ideal target. What followed in the decades after Lindisfarne was not a single campaign or a coordinated strategy. It was a pattern of expansion driven by dozens of independent actors, making independent calculations about where to go and what to take. Consider what it must have looked like from a small Irish monastery on a sea cliff in the winter of 800. The Annals of Ulster, one of the most important records of Irish history from this period, began noting Norse raids on the Irish coast from around 795. The island monastery of Iona, founded by the great Irish saint Columba in the 6th century and one of the most revered sites in the Christian world, was attacked at least 3 times in the early 9th century. The annals record that in 806, 68 members of the Iona community were killed in a single raid, and the survivors eventually relocated their most precious relics to a safer location inland. Picture the community that remained after that raid. The empty choir stalls, the burned outbuildings, the silence where there had been singing. The monks who survived would have understood this not as a military defeat, but as the end of something they had believed was protected by God Himself. For them, the question was not strategic. It was theological. How could this have happened to a place this holy? The Norse who carried out that raid almost certainly understood none of that. They had found a concentration of valuable objects in an accessible location defended by unarmed men. They had done what the logic of their situation invited them to do. The theological devastation they left behind was invisible to them. This gap in understanding between the devastating meaning of the raids to those who experienced them and the practical calculation of those who conducted them runs through the entire 1st century of the Viking Age. It also explains something important about why European rulers found the threat so difficult to counter. When Charlemagne strengthened the coastal defenses of his empire, he was trying to counter a centralized military threat that did not exist. There was no Norse high command, no coordinating strategy, no army to decisively defeat. There were dozens, eventually hundreds, of independent raiding parties making independent decisions about independent targets. Stopping them required a fundamentally different kind of defensive thinking, and it took European rulers generations to develop it. Through the first decades of the 9th century, the raids expanded dramatically. Norse ships appeared on the coast of Francia, attacking the wealthy trading town of Dorestad on the Rhine multiple times in the 830s and 40s. They sailed around the Iberian Peninsula and into the Mediterranean. They sacked Seville. They appeared off the coast of Italy in ways that scattered shock through communities that had considered themselves beyond any possible reach of northern sea raiders. In Ireland, the pattern evolved faster than almost anywhere else. Hit-and-run raids on coastal monasteries gradually transformed into something more permanent. Norse groups began establishing long forts, fortified harbor positions where ships could overwinter, and operations could continue year-round rather than being confined to the summer sailing season. Imagine standing on the southern bank of the river Liffey sometime around 841, watching a Norse longfort take shape on the opposite shore, timber palisades going up, ships pulled onto the bank, fires burning through the night. This was not a raiding party that would be gone by morning. This was a community being built with the deliberate intention of staying. The people watching from the Irish side understood, perhaps for the first time, that what had begun as seasonal terror had become something more permanent. The Norse had found a place they wanted to keep. That long fort on the Liffey was the beginning of Dublin. This transition from raiding to settling is one of the most important dynamics of the entire Viking Age. The line between Viking raider and Viking settler was not a sharp one. It was a spectrum along which different people moved at different speeds and in response to different opportunities. And the Century of Fire was also, from its very beginning, a century of roots being put down in foreign soil. Meanwhile, in England, the raids were intensifying towards something that would go far beyond anything the early decades had produced. The targets were no longer just monasteries on islands. They were towns, markets, the economic infrastructure of kingdoms. And, by the middle of the 9th century, what was coming to England was not a raiding party. It was an army. Chapter 4. The Great Army and the Conquest of England. In the autumn of 865, the people of East Anglia watched a fleet beach itself on their coastline and disgorge a force unlike anything the Viking Age had produced before. Not a raiding party, not even a large raiding party. An army, organized, coordinated, equipped for extended campaigning, and led by men who had not crossed the North Sea to take silver home to Scandinavia. They had come for land, and they intended to stay on it. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls it the Great Heathen Army, a name that has survived in historical writing for more than 1,000 years because it captures something true about how the people on the receiving end experienced it. Something had fundamentally changed. The rules, such as they were, no longer applied. How large was this force? It is a question historians have debated for generations. And the honest answer is that we do not know with precision. The chronicles describe it in terms designed to convey overwhelming scale. But chronicles of this period routinely inflated enemy numbers, partly from genuine uncertainty, and partly because a larger enemy makes a more compelling narrative. Archaeological evidence provides more grounded estimates. Excavations at Repton in Derbyshire, led by scholars Martin Biddle and Berth Kielby Biddle, uncovered evidence of a Viking Age mass burial that scholars have associated with the Great Army, suggesting a force capable of continuous campaigning across multiple kingdoms simultaneously. Several thousand men at minimum, possibly considerably more. The army was led, according to later Norse sources and saga tradition, by the sons of a figure named Ragnar Lothbrok, whose historical existence is itself a matter of scholarly debate. Whether Ragnar was a real man, a composite of several leaders, or a figure who accumulated historical associations over time is a question the sources cannot definitively resolve. What is less disputed is that his attributed sons, Ivar, Halfdan, and Ubba among them, appear as real individuals whose actions are corroborated across multiple independent sources. Ivar, known in later tradition as Ivar the Boneless, is the most prominent. His epithet has generated enormous speculation. Some scholars have suggested it refers to a physical condition. Others read it as a poetic term in Old Norse literary tradition referring to flexibility or cunning. The truth is probably unrecoverable, and what the name meant matters far less than what the army he helped lead accomplished. The Great Army moved through the English kingdoms with a strategic coherence that distinguishes it sharply from anything that had come before. It did not simply raid. It seized and held. It wintered in captured territory. It demonstrated an understanding of English political geography, of which kingdoms were internally divided, which borders were weak, which rulers could be exploited, and which needed to be destroyed. That suggests its leaders had been thinking carefully about England long before they arrived. The first major objective was York, which the army seized on the 1st of November, 866, exploiting a civil war between two rival claimants to the Northumbrian throne. When the two rival kings briefly set aside their conflict and mounted a joint counterattack in 867, the army destroyed both their forces and killed both kings in a single engagement. Northumbria, as an independent kingdom, effectively ceased to exist. East Anglia fell in 869. Its king Edmund chose to resist rather than submit, and what happened to him was recorded in sources that made him a martyr of the Christian Church. He was captured and killed. The details in later accounts are elaborate, and their historical reliability is contested. But the core fact is clear. Edmund died. East Anglia fell, and the Great Army had neutralized 3 of the 4 major English kingdoms. Only Wessex remained. Alfred was not king when the campaign against Wessex began in 871. He was the youngest of 4 brothers, not the expected heir to anything. His eldest brother Ethelred was king, and Alfred commanded part of the West Saxon forces under him. He fought at Ashdown in January of 871, a genuine West Saxon victory, one of the few clear English battlefield successes of the entire campaign. Ethelred died in April of 871, probably from wounds or illness connected to the relentless fighting of that year. Alfred became King of Wessex at the worst possible moment. Here is something about Alfred that the legend consistently smooths over, but which the sources, when read carefully, make clear. He was ill for much of his adult life. From his early 20s onward, the sources describe a condition that caused him physical suffering at unpredictable intervals, something that no physician of his time could explain or reliably treat. The precise nature of this illness has been examined by medical historians for generations, with scholarly discussion ranging from Crohn's disease to other inflammatory conditions that modern researchers continue to debate. What is certain is that Alfred governed, planned, fought, and eventually won not from a position of robust physical health, but from one of chronic vulnerability and chronic pain. He bought time in 871 by paying tribute to the Great Army. The tradition built around Alfred as the heroic resister, tends to minimize this transaction. But paying tribute to buy time is not surrender. It is a tactical decision made by a man who understood the difference between the battle in front of him and the war he was actually trying to win. The crisis came in the winter of 877 to 78. A Norse leader named Guthrum launched a midwinter attack on Wessex that caught the West Saxon forces completely off guard. Alfred fled with a small group of followers into the Somerset marshes. The king of the last independent English kingdom was a fugitive in his own territory, hiding in the wetlands, with no army, no secure base, and no obvious path back to anything. He was also almost certainly ill. The winter was cold. The marshes were no place for a man in good health, let alone one who had carried whatever condition plagued him since his 20s. There is a detail, likely legendary but emotionally true to the situation, that has followed Alfred through history for 1,200 years. The story of a peasant woman who sheltered him without knowing who he was, set him to watch her cakes baking on the fire, and came back to find them burned because his mind was elsewhere. Whether that happened or not, it captures something real about what that winter must have been. A king reduced to someone else's hearth, trying to think his way back from nothing, while the bread burned and the cold pressed in from every direction. And yet from those marshes, over the following months, he organized, he sent messengers, he gathered men, he planned. In the spring of 878, he emerged and defeated Guthrum's forces at the Battle of Edington. The victory was real. What followed was the Treaty of Wedmore and the agreement establishing the Danelaw, the territory in northern and eastern England where Norse law applied and Norse settlement was recognized. Guthrum accepted Christian baptism with Alfred standing as his godfather. He took the Christian name Athelstan and ruled East Anglia under that name until his death around 890. The man who had driven Alfred into the marshes ended his life as a baptized Christian king, ruling an English kingdom with Alfred's blessing. Of all the strange outcomes the Viking Age produced, this one deserves a moment of genuine pause. The Danelaw covered roughly the northeastern half of England, and its boundaries are preserved in the modern landscape in the distribution of place names with Scandinavian origins. Towns whose names end in the Old Norse suffix by, meaning settlement or farm, like Derby, Grimsby, and Whitby, mark the territory where Norse settlers put down roots and stayed. More than 200 English towns and villages carry this suffix, each one a linguistic fossil from the Viking Age, preserving in the modern map the memory of a settlement made more than 1,000 years ago. The Norse who came to England did not leave. They became English, slowly and incompletely, and in ways that left traces in the language, the law, and the population that are still measurable today. But while Alfred was in the marshes and the Great Army was campaigning across England, something equally significant was happening in a completely different direction. A different group of Norse travelers, following a different set of rivers toward different destinations, was building something that had nothing to do with monasteries or English kingdoms. They were sailing east, toward Byzantium, toward Baghdad, toward a trading network that would eventually leave hundreds of thousands of Islamic silver coins buried in Swedish soil. Chapter 5. East, the Varangians, and the road to Byzantium. Ahmad ibn Fadlan was not a man who frightened easily. He was a scholar and diplomat from Baghdad, one of the most sophisticated cities in the world, sent in 921 as part of an embassy from the Abbasid Caliph to the king of the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people living along the middle reaches of the Volga River. He had traveled extensively, navigated the complex politics of the Abbasid court, and was accustomed to encountering people and customs very different from his own. But when he met the Rus on the banks of the Volga, he stopped and stared. He described them in his written account, which survived in partial form in later manuscripts and was rediscovered by scholars in the 20th century, as the most perfectly built people he had ever seen. Tall as date palms, he wrote, with reddish hair and fair skin. He described their clothing, their weapons, their customs, their funerals, their hygiene practices, which he found troubling by his own cultural standards. He described a river trading camp that was both impressive and disturbing, a place of energy and commerce and ritual, operating according to principles entirely unlike those of the world he came from. What Ibn Fadlan was documenting with such precise and uncomfortable fascination were Scandinavians, Norse traders and warriors who had, over the preceding century and a half, pushed so far into Eastern Europe along its river systems that they had become a permanent feature of the political and commercial landscape from the Baltic Sea to the Caspian. To understand how they got there, you have to start again with geography, because Eastern Europe in this period is above all else a landscape defined by rivers. The great rivers of Eastern Europe run roughly north to south in a way that functions, for people capable of navigating them, as a connected highway system between two of the most important trading zones in the medieval world. The Dnieper rises in the forests of what is now Western Russia and flows south to empty into the Black Sea. From the Black Sea, it is a short sail to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Still in the 9th century, the largest and wealthiest city in the Christian world. The Volga rises not far from the Dnieper's headwaters and flows east and then south to empty into the Caspian Sea, from which the trading cities of the Abbasid Caliphate are accessible. Between these river systems, with relatively short overland portages connecting them, lies a network of waterways that functionally links the Baltic coast to both Constantinople and the Islamic world. For people with the Longship, capable of both open water sailing and shallow draft river navigation, this network was an invitation. Norse traders and warriors began moving into Eastern Europe in the late 8th century. Around the same time, their counterparts were beginning to raid the coasts of England and Ireland. They moved along the rivers, establishing trading posts at strategic points, developing relationships with the Slavic and Finnish peoples of the interior, moving south toward the wealth at the river system's far ends. The people they became in this Eastern context are referred to in Byzantine sources as Varangians and in Arabic sources as the Rus. The word Rus, whose precise origin is debated among scholars, is most widely connected by current research to a Finnish term for the Swedish Norse that was subsequently adopted by the Slavic peoples of the region. That word eventually gave its name to the territory where Norse influence became most deeply rooted. And according to the most widely accepted scholarly view, to the country that grew from that territory. The name Russia carries in its first syllable the memory of the Norse traders who paddled down its rivers 12 centuries ago. The earliest confirmed Norse settlement in Eastern Europe is at Staraya Ladoga, on the Volkhov River, south of the modern city of St. Petersburg, where archaeological evidence of Scandinavian presence dates to the mid-8th century. This is earlier than Lindisfarne. The Norse movement east began at the same time as, or before, the famous raids west, a dimension of Viking history that tends to be underemphasized in Western European-focused popular accounts, though the reasons for this are more about the geography of the sources than any deliberate omission. From Ladoga, the river network extended south. Novgorod, on the Volkhov, became one of the most important early Norse settlements. Further south, on high bluffs above the Dnieper, a settlement controlling the critical passage between the northern forests and the southern steppe was developing into a city. Kiev, known in the Norse sources as Konagard, the city of kings, would eventually become the center of a state whose founding is one of the most debated questions in Eastern European history. The Primary Chronicle, a 12th century Slavic historical text, contains an account of this founding that has been argued about ever since it was written. It describes the Slavic tribes of the region as unable to govern themselves and inviting a Norse leader named Rurik to come and rule them. An event it dates to 862. Modern scholars treat this invitation narrative with considerable skepticism. The story of an indigenous people voluntarily requesting outside rulers is a recurring motif in medieval historical writing that usually reflects the political needs of the period when the chronicle was composed rather than actual events. The archaeological evidence suggests a more gradual and contested process of Norse influence and authority than a single founding moment implies. But Rurik himself may have been a real person, and the dynasty bearing his name ruled in Russian principalities from the 9th century until 1598, a span of more than 700 years. The relationship between the Kievan Rus and Byzantine Constantinople moved through phases of conflict, negotiation, and eventually deep cultural integration that reshaped both parties. Norse forces attacked Constantinople at least twice in the 9th century, producing not conquest but commercial treaties that gave Norse traders privileged access to Byzantine markets. The Byzantines, characteristically pragmatic, turned military adversaries into trading partners and eventually into something more useful still. The Varangian Guard was one of the most remarkable institutions in the medieval world, an elite military unit composed of Norse and later Northern European warriors serving as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. It existed because the Byzantines had grasped a counterintuitive truth about loyalty. Foreign warriors with no connection to Byzantine court politics, no local patron, no stake in the succession struggles that consumed the empire's internal life, were paradoxically more reliable than Greek or Balkan soldiers who might have competing obligations. The Guard was formally established in 988 as part of a treaty between Prince Vladimir of Kiev and the Emperor Basil II. Vladimir sent 6,000 Norse warriors to Constantinople as part of an agreement that also involved his own conversion to Christianity and his marriage to a Byzantine princess. Among the men who would eventually serve in the Varangian Guard was a Norwegian prince named Harald, who would later be known as Harald Hardrada. He arrived in Constantinople in the 1030s as a young man with a reputation for military capability and left years later with wealth, experience, and connections that would help him seize the throne of Norway. His story connects directly to the ending of the Viking Age, and we will return to him. The dirham evidence is one of the most striking physical demonstrations of how sustained the Eastern trading network was. Dirham were silver coins produced by the Abbasid Caliphate, the standard currency of the Islamic world. They have been found in Scandinavian archaeological contexts in numbers that still astonish researchers. Hoards containing thousands of Islamic coins have been excavated across Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and the Baltic islands of Gotland and Åland. The total number recovered runs to the hundreds of thousands. These coins did not travel from Baghdad to Sweden by accident. They are the physical residue of a sustained, organized, long-distance trading network that connected the Norse world directly to the economic heart of medieval Islam. Operating across thousands of kilometers of river and sea for more than 2 centuries, they are physical proof of something that the monastery-burning narrative of the Viking Age has always struggled to contain. The Norse were participants in one of the most sophisticated commercial systems in the medieval world, operating at a geographic scale that most contemporary European peoples could not have imagined. Ibn Fadlan watched the Rus on the Volga bank for weeks, recording what he saw with the careful eye of an educated man encountering a genuinely new world. He described a ship funeral of extraordinary ritual complexity, the burial of a great chieftain in a vessel surrounded by his possessions, his animals, and a woman who went with him in death. He described the chanting and the ceremony and the fire that consumed everything. He described his own reactions, the combination of fascination and revulsion that runs through his account like a current. His account is one of the most valuable documents we have about how the Norse actually lived and what they believed, precisely because it comes from outside the tradition. He had no reason to romanticize them and no reason to demonize them beyond his own cultural reactions. He was simply a very good observer writing down what he saw, in language precise enough that scholars 12 centuries later can still feel the heat of that fire on the Volga bank. The eastern dimension of the Viking Age is the dimension that popular culture has most consistently overlooked. The television shows and the films focus overwhelmingly on raids in England and adventures in the North Atlantic. But, measured in geographic scale, economic impact, and long-term political consequence, the Norse movement east shaped the world in ways that deserve equal attention. And even the Western story was not finished. While some Norse traveled east along rivers toward Baghdad, and others were conquering territory in England, a third movement was happening in a completely different direction. Not east, not south, but out into the open North Atlantic, away from every coastline that had ever been mapped, toward an island no one had claimed, and eventually a continent no one in the European world knew was there. That journey began with a man who had been thrown out of everywhere else and had nowhere left to go but further. Chapter 6. North Iceland, Greenland, and the edge of the known world. Erik Thorvaldsson had a temper. This is one of the few things about him that the sagas agree on without ambiguity. He was Norwegian by birth, the son of a man who had himself been exiled from Norway for manslaughter, which suggests the temper ran in the family. Erik grew up in Iceland, where his father had settled after the exile. He farmed. He married a woman named Theodhild. He had children. He tried to live the ordinary life of a Norse Icelandic farmer. He could not stop killing people. The first serious incident ended with Erik outlawed from his district in Iceland for the murder of several men over a property dispute involving carved wooden beams. He moved to another part of the island. There were more killings, more legal proceedings, more enemies. Eventually, around the year 982, the Icelandic Althing outlawed him from the entire island for 3 years. He had already heard reports of land to the west. Sailors blown off course in North Atlantic storms had glimpsed coastlines through the fog, mountains visible in the distance, land that no one had mapped or named. With nowhere left to go in the known Norse world, Erik loaded a ship with his family and followers and sailed west to find it. He found it, a large island, much of it beneath one of the largest ice sheets in the world, with a relatively narrow strip of ice-free coastal land along its southern and western edges that was, in the climatic conditions of the late 10th century, genuinely habitable. He spent 3 years exploring it, surviving winters on it, assessing what it could offer. When his period of outlawry ended, he returned to Iceland with a proposal. He called the island Greenland. The question of why has been discussed for centuries. The saga tradition preserves a remark attributed to Eric, suggesting that an attractive name would help recruit settlers. The fuller picture is more interesting. Paleoclimatological research. The study of past climates through ice cores and lake sediments and other geological evidence indicates that the late 10th century coincided with what climate scientists call the medieval warm period, a phase of relatively elevated temperatures across the North Atlantic, lasting approximately from 900 to 1200 of the Common Era. In those conditions, the southern coastal strips of Greenland were genuinely more hospitable than they would become when the climate cooled. The name was perhaps less misleading than it appears from our colder vantage point. The settlements Eric established, and that grew over the following decades, were real communities. Not outposts or temporary camps, but farms, churches, and a social structure whose peak population, based on archaeological surveys conducted by Danish and Greenlandic researchers over the 20th century, scholars have placed in the range of several hundred to perhaps 2,000 people, depending on the period and the methodology used. They raised cattle, they hunted walrus for ivory and rope, they maintained regular contact with Iceland and Norway, participating in trade networks that connected them to markets across Europe. Norse Greenland sustained itself at the absolute margin of the habitable world for approximately 500 years. The Althing that Iceland had established in 930 was the institution that made the North Atlantic settlement chain possible as a coherent social project. It was a general assembly, held annually at a dramatic landscape of volcanic rock and open meadow called Thingvellir in southwestern Iceland, at which the leading men of the island gathered to hear law, resolve disputes, and make collective decisions. The law speaker was its most remarkable office. In a society without widespread literacy and without a bureaucratic infrastructure to record and enforce its rules, the entire legal code of the community was memorized and recited by a single individual over a 3-year cycle. The law speaker stood at the law rock at Thingvellir and recited. Everyone listened. The law existed because it was remembered and spoken, sustained by a single human memory, renewed each year in the open air of the Icelandic summer. Scholars who study comparative legal and political history describe the Althing as one of the oldest continuously operating parliamentary institutions in the world, while carefully noting that the comparison requires acknowledging genuine differences between what the Althing was and what later European parliamentary bodies became. The continuous thread of institutional identity connecting the 930 Assembly to the modern Parliament of Iceland is real and recognized by Icelanders themselves as fundamental to their national identity. The literary culture Iceland developed in this period is itself an extraordinary legacy. The Icelandic sagas, prose narratives written down mostly in the 12th and 13th centuries, but drawing on oral traditions stretching back to the settlement period, are among the most sophisticated literary productions of the medieval world. They are psychologically acute, structurally complex, told with a restraint and irony that modern readers find startlingly contemporary. They are also the primary sources for much of what we know about the Viking Age, which means that reading them requires holding two things simultaneously: their value as literature and their limitations as history. The sagas were written 200 to 300 years after the events they describe. Their authors worked from oral tradition, earlier written fragments, and their own literary imaginations. They contain genuine historical information, corroborated in many cases by archaeology and external sources. They also contain legend, political bias, and narrative invention. It is from the sagas that we have the account of what happened next in the Norse North Atlantic story. Around the year 985, a Norse trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing from Iceland to Greenland when storms blew him off course. He sighted land to the west that did not match any description of Greenland he had heard. Forested in some places, flat in others. He did not go ashore. He turned and eventually found Greenland and his father's farm. But he talked about what he had seen. And Norse Greenland, that small and distant community clinging to the edge of the habitable world, sat with that knowledge for years. The land to the west was real. Someone had seen it. The question was, who would go there next? And why? And what they would find when they arrived. The answer would come from Erik's own family. And what they found would change in ways none of them could possibly have imagined. The story of an entire hemisphere. Chapter 7. Leif Eriksson and Vinland, America. 500 years early. On the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland, in the Canadian province of Newfoundland and Labrador, there is a place called Meadows. It sits on a low headland above a shallow bay, surrounded by bog and sea and a sky that, in summer, can be brilliantly clear, and in winter can close down to almost nothing. It is remote by any standard. The nearest significant town is more than 40 kilometers away, along a road not built until the 20th century. The landscape has not changed much from what it looked like 1,000 years ago, which is part of why what was found there still carries such weight. In 1960, a Norwegian writer and explorer named Helge Ingstad arrived at Meadows after years of searching the northeastern coast of North America for physical evidence of the Norse voyages described in the Icelandic sagas. He had been told by a local fisherman named George Decker about some old ruins in the bog. Ingstad looked at the grass-covered mounds and recognized their shape. They were the buried outlines of Norse longhouses. His wife, Anne Steen Ingstad, a trained archaeologist, led the excavations that followed between 1961 and 1968. What they found beneath the grass was a settlement with 8 structures, including large longhouses whose construction techniques matched precisely those used in Norse, Iceland, and Greenland during the 10th and 11th centuries. A smithy with a small ironworking furnace, iron rivets of the type used in Norse boat repair, a bronze cloak pin of distinctly Norse design, and butternuts, a species of nut that does not grow in Newfoundland but is native to the St. Lawrence Valley further south and west. Evidence that the people at this site were ranging considerably beyond it. The site was dated by radiocarbon methods to approximately the year 1000 of the Common Era, with a margin of error of roughly 50 years in either direction. Subsequent analysis using more refined techniques has consistently confirmed this date range. Multiple independent teams of archaeologists have reviewed the evidence. The conclusion they have reached is not a theory or an interpretation. It is a finding. The Norse were in North America around 500 years before Columbus was born. Meadows became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978, recognized as a site of outstanding universal significance. It is the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America, the only place where physical evidence has conclusively demonstrated a pre-Columbian European presence in the Americas. The evidence is not disputed. Now, what do the sagas say? And where does the saga account end and the archaeological certainty begin? Two sagas deal specifically with the Norse voyages to the western lands. The Greenlander's saga and Eirik's saga. They agree on the broad outlines and disagree on significant details, which is exactly what you would expect from two independent literary traditions drawing on the same underlying events while shaping them for their own purposes 2 or 3 centuries after the fact. Both describe a series of voyages from Greenland to lands to the west, beginning with Bjarni Herjolfsson's accidental sighting and followed by a deliberate expedition led by Leif, the son of Eric the Red. Both sagas place this expedition at approximately the year 1000, a date that aligns reasonably well with the archaeological dating of Meadows. Leif's expedition reached multiple territories along the North American coast and gave them names: Helluland, Flat Rockland, which most scholars tentatively identify with Baffin Island, Markland, Forest Land, most likely Labrador, and Vinland, described in the sagas as a place of wild grapes or meadows, whose precise location has been debated by scholars for decades. Whether Landsok's Meadows is the Vinland of the sagas, a base camp for wider exploration of the Gulf of St. Lawrence region, or one of multiple Norse sites in North America that have not been found or have not survived, remains an open question. The archaeologist Birgitta Wallace, who led later excavations at the site for Parks Canada and is among the foremost authorities on it, has argued persuasively that Lonzo Meadows was most likely a base camp rather than the permanent settlement the sagas describe, the staging point for explorations further south. The butternuts support this interpretation. Butternut trees grow in the St. Lawrence Valley and along the eastern seaboard as far south as what is now the northeastern United States. They do not grow in Newfoundland. Someone brought those butternuts to Landsok's Meadows from somewhere further south. The Norse at that site were going places. The site itself does not directly record. The sagas offer two overlapping explanations for why the Norse did not stay: distance and conflict. The distance from the Greenland settlements to even the nearest point of the North American coast made regular resupply extremely difficult. Iceland, the nearest substantial Norse community, was several weeks of open ocean sailing beyond Greenland. The infrastructure needed to sustain permanent colonization simply could not be assembled across that distance quickly enough to matter. And the people who were already there were not going to make it easy. The sagas refer to them as skraelings, a term that carried derogatory connotations in Old Norse. The encounters described begin with mutual curiosity and deteriorate into violence. The Norse, far from their supply lines and moving through a landscape they did not know, among people who understood it completely, found that the advantages that had served them so well in Europe did not translate to this context. After some years, the attempts were abandoned. The physical traces were covered by grass and bog. The sagas preserve the memory of the voyages in the oral tradition of a small island community at the edge of the world. And for nearly 960 years, that was where the story stayed. Here is where the history becomes a mirror reflecting something beyond itself. Columbus sailed in 1492, backed by the Spanish crown, equipped for extended ocean passage, and arrived in the Caribbean. He received credit. In the European historical tradition that subsequently dominated this story, for discovering the Americas, that credit was taught in schools across the Western world for centuries, and in many places still is. The Norse voyages were not secret. They were preserved in saga literature, available to anyone who could read Old Norse. What changed in 1960 was not the existence of the evidence, but the physical confirmation of it. Los Meadows made the Norse presence in North America undeniable in terms that could not be dismissed as legend. The indigenous peoples of North America had been living on the continent for at least 15,000 years before either Leif Eriksson or Columbus arrived. In any meaningful sense of the word, they discovered it. What European arrival represented, in both the Norse case and the later sustained colonization, was contact between two hemispheres that had been separated since the end of the last ice age. The Norse contact produced no lasting transformation of the continent, not because the Norse were more enlightened than later arrivals, but because they came in insufficient numbers, from a base too distant to sustain, and left without establishing the permanent presence that subsequent colonization would create. What happened is this. Around the year 1000, Norse people from Greenland built a camp on the coast of Newfoundland, repaired their ships, processed timber, explored a coastline further south than anyone in their world had ever gone, and then sailed back across the Atlantic to the lives they had left behind. The camp sat under the grass for nearly 960 years. A fisherman mentioned some old ruins to a Norwegian with the right question already in his mind, and the story that had been waiting under the ground came back into the light. Chapter 8. The Viking World at Home, Not Just Warriors. Sometime in the mid-9th century, in the trading town of Hedeby, at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, a woman sat down at a loom. We do not know her name. We do not know if she was a jarl's wife, or a craftsperson working for trade, or a thrall performing labor she had no choice about. What we know is what archaeologists found when they excavated the remains of Hedeby across the 20th century. Textile fragments preserved in the waterlogged soil of the harbor. Fragments showing weave structures of considerable technical complexity. Patterns that required not just skill, but the kind of accumulated knowledge passed from one generation to the next over decades. The kind of knowledge that does not survive unless someone decides it is worth preserving and worth teaching. That woman at her loom was not a warrior. She was not a raider. She was not the figure that appears in the television shows and the museum exhibitions and the popular histories. She was a craftsperson doing technically demanding work in a commercial town that was, at its peak, one of the largest urban centers in Northern Europe. And she is as much a part of the Viking Age as the man with the axe. This chapter is the one most documentaries skip, not because the information is unavailable, but because it does not fit the narrative that popular culture has decided to tell. Warriors are cinematic. Weavers are not. Raids generate drama. The daily organization of a Norse household does not. And so, the story of how most Norse people actually lived most of the time gets compressed into a few sentences or dropped entirely, leaving behind a portrait of a civilization that is vivid and entirely incomplete. The problem runs deeper than entertainment preferences. It is a problem of sources, and it shapes everything we think we know about the Viking Age. Almost everything the medieval written record preserved about the Norse came from two kinds of documents. Documents written by the people they attacked, primarily the clergy of England, Ireland, and Francia, who had every reason to describe their attackers in the most extreme terms available to them. And documents written in Iceland 2 to 3 centuries after the events they describe, shaped by literary conventions and political concerns that were not identical to the realities of 9th century Norse life. The monks were not writing ethnographies. They were writing about catastrophe, through a theological lens that interpreted the raiders as instruments of divine punishment. In that framework, nuance about domestic Norse life was simply beside the point. What corrects this is archaeology. The ground does not have a theological agenda. It preserves what was actually there, and what the past 50 years of systematic excavation at Norse sites across Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and the areas of Norse settlement in Britain and Ireland has revealed is a picture of considerably greater complexity than the written sources alone would ever suggest. Norse society was structured around a hierarchy of 3 tiers. At the top were the jarls, the high-status aristocracy who controlled significant land holdings and commanded the loyalty of warriors and dependent farmers. Below them were the carls, the free farmers and craftspeople who formed the productive backbone of Norse communities, the people who grew the food, built the ships, made the objects, and raised the children that made Norse society function. And below them were the thralls. The thrall population deserves direct acknowledgement here, rather than a footnote. Slavery was not peripheral to the Norse world. It was central to its economic functioning, particularly in the early Viking Age, when raiding was at its most intense. The capture and sale of human beings was among the most profitable activities that Norse raiders engaged in. The demand for enslaved labor within Scandinavia itself was significant. And archaeological evidence, including burial sites where individuals were interred in positions consistent with servile status, confirms that thralls were present throughout Norse communities. The Norse word thrall has entered the English language as a general term meaning captivity or control. That linguistic inheritance carries within it the memory of an institution that shaped the Viking Age from its earliest decades to its end. Within the free population, the distinction between jarls and carls was real and significant, but not absolutely fixed. The mechanism that created some social mobility was the same mechanism that drove so much of the external expansion: the sea, and the opportunity it represented. A carl who participated successfully in a trading voyage or a raiding expedition could return with enough wealth to materially improve his position. The path upward was difficult and available to relatively few, but it existed, and its existence shaped how Norse society understood ambition and what it valued in human capability. The physical environment of Norse domestic life has been reconstructed through decades of excavation. The typical Norse farmstead was organized around a longhouse, a long rectangular structure with thick walls of turf, stone, or timber depending on local materials, a central hearth running the length of the main space, and a single large interior divided by function rather than by walls. Sleeping areas along the long walls, food preparation near the hearth, storage for tools and winter supplies, and in many cases, at one end of the building, space for livestock during the months when the cold would kill them if left outside. The smell and the noise of that environment, by any modern standard, would have been overwhelming. But sharing a building with cattle and sheep through a Scandinavian winter is not poverty or ignorance. It is an intelligent response to a specific environmental challenge. The warmth of the animals supplementing the heat of the hearth. The survival of both people and livestock depending on the same walls, keeping the same cold out. The material culture recovered from Norse domestic sites consistently tells the story of people who cared deeply about the quality and appearance of their possessions. The carved wooden objects from the Osberg burial, sledges and beds, and a cart decorated with interlacing animal forms, demonstrate craft skill at the absolute limit of what hand tools can produce. Norse metalwork in silver, bronze, and occasionally gold shows a similar commitment to technical excellence and aesthetic refinement. These are not the possessions of people who valued only brute force. They are the possessions of people who cared about beautiful things and were capable of making them. The position of women in Norse society requires careful handling because it has been both overstated and understated in popular accounts, often in different parts of the same narrative, and because the evidence is genuinely complex. Free Norse women had legal rights that compared favorably with those of women in most contemporary European societies. They could own property independently. They could initiate divorce under circumstances specified in Norse law and retain their own property afterward. They managed the household economy, which, in an agrarian society, meant managing a significant domain of real authority and real decision-making. The keys that appear so frequently in high-status female burials are not symbolic. They are functional objects representing the authority of the woman who held them over the storage and distribution of a household's resources. These rights are documented in Norse legal codes and confirmed in the archaeological record of female burials. They are real and significant. A 9th century Norse woman had more formal legal standing in certain respects than many of her contemporaries in Christian Europe, where church doctrine increasingly constrained female autonomy. The Birka warrior burial requires specific treatment because it is the most discussed and most contested piece of evidence for female roles in Norse martial culture. Grave BJ, 581, excavated at the Viking Age trading town of Birka in Sweden in 1878, contained a complete set of warrior equipment, including a sword, an axe, a spear, armor-piercing arrows, 2 shields, and 2 horses. Grave goods consistent with those of the highest status warrior burials of the period. For more than a century after its excavation, the grave was assumed to contain a male warrior. In 2017, a research team led by Charlotte Hedenstierna Johnson published the results of ancient DNA analysis of the skeletal remains in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. The individual in the grave was genetically female. The finding generated enormous popular attention and was widely reported as definitive proof that female Viking warriors existed. The actual scholarly picture is more nuanced. The DNA analysis is solid on the biological sex question. What remains actively debated is the interpretation. Some scholars argue the burial represents a high-status woman who held a genuine warrior or military leadership role. Others note that the relationship between biological sex and social gender in the Viking Age cannot be assumed to match modern Western categories, and that the burial might represent a more complex social identity. Methodological questions have also been raised by some researchers. What the Birka burial is, without question, is evidence that the relationship between gender and martial status in Norse society was more complicated than a simple story of an entirely male warrior culture allows. What it is not, without considerably more supporting evidence, is proof that female warriors were common or that women generally participated in military roles. A single burial is a data point. A data point is not a pattern. Both of these things are true simultaneously. And the honesty of this story requires saying both. The trading dimension of Norse society is perhaps the most powerful corrective to the pure warrior narrative, because the physical evidence for it is overwhelming and consistent across multiple sites in multiple countries. Hedeby, at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, in what is now northern Germany. He was at its peak in the 9th and 10th centuries, one of the largest urban centers in northern Europe, covering approximately 24 hectares, with a population archaeologists estimate at somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 people. Specialized workshops produce glass beads, iron objects, textile, and leather goods for both local consumption and export. A harbor capable of accommodating ocean-going vessels. A system of streets, and a defensive rampart. A town worth building and worth protecting. The goods that moved through Hedeby and through similar Norse trading centers at Birka in Sweden, Kaupang in Norway, and Ribe in Denmark tell the story of a commercial network of extraordinary geographic reach. Arabic silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate, silk from Byzantium, glass from the Rhineland, walrus ivory from the Arctic, amber from the Baltic, furs from the boreal forests of Scandinavia and Russia, wool textiles, and slaves. These goods did not arrive by accident. They are the physical evidence of sustained, organized commercial relationships maintained across thousands of kilometers over multiple generations. The Norse were as much merchants as they were raiders. Many individuals were probably both at different points in their lives. In a world where the boundary between armed trade and trading raid was situational rather than categorical. But the commercial dimension of Norse life is as real as the raids, and is central to understanding what the Viking Age actually was. The raids happened. The violence was real. The terror was genuine. And the same people who produced that terror also built Hedeby, established the Althing, wrote the sagas, carved the Oseberg prow, and maintained trading relationships from the Arctic to Baghdad for centuries. Both things were always true. The civilization was always more than one of its faces. Chapter 9. Gods, Fate, and the Norse Mind. On a cold morning, sometime in the 9th or 10th century, a Norse farmer in Iceland or Norway or the Danelaw woke up, looked at the sky, made a decision about what the day required, and went to work. What was in his mind when he looked at that sky? What framework did he carry for understanding the world he was moving through? The forces that governed it? The question of what his own life was for and how he was supposed to live it. Not what Marvel gave you, not the cleaned up, modernized, superhero-adjacent version of Odin and Thor and Loki that billions of people now carry in their heads as a result of a franchise that was not primarily designed to accurately represent 9th century Scandinavian theology. The actual Norse religious tradition was older, stranger, more regionally varied, less systematically organized, and in certain respects more philosophically interesting than any movie has been willing to show. Begin with what the Norse gods were not. They were not omnipotent. Odin could be tricked. Thor could be embarrassed. Loki caused problems that even the assembled gods could not always solve. The Norse pantheon was not a collection of all-powerful divine beings arranging the universe from a position of absolute control. It was a collection of powerful but fallible beings navigating a cosmos that had its own logic, its own dangers, and its own inexorable trajectory toward an ending that even the gods could not prevent. They were not eternal. Every Norse deity moved through time toward a fixed point at which they would die. This is perhaps the single most distinctive feature of Norse theology, compared to the other major religious traditions of the medieval world. And it is the key to understanding almost everything else about how the Norse approached the question of how to live. The Norse religious tradition we call Norse mythology was not a unified, codified system. It had no authoritative sacred text, no professional priesthood with hierarchical authority. It was a living tradition that varied by region and community, evolved over time, absorbed influences from neighboring cultures, and existed primarily in oral form until Christian-era scholars, most importantly the Icelander Snorri Sturluson, writing in the early 13th century, committed it to parchment in the forms we know best today. Snorri's prose Edda is invaluable. It is also a document written by a Christian author roughly 2 centuries after Iceland's conversion from the faith it describes, drawing on earlier poetry and oral tradition and shaping that material with his own literary and theological purposes. The Elder Edda, a collection of Old Norse poetry preserved in a 13th century Icelandic manuscript and considered our most important source for Norse mythological verse, provides an older layer of material that scholars compare carefully against Snorri's later systematic account. Both sources are essential. Both require the same careful handling. The cosmology they describe organizes the universe around a great world tree called Yggdrasil, an enormous ash whose roots and branches connect 9 distinct realms of existence. Midgard, the middle enclosure, is the world of human beings. Above it is Asgard, the realm of the Aesir gods, connected to the human world by Bifrost. The Rainbow Bridge. Below and around are other realms, including Jotunheim, home of the giants, who are the primary antagonists of the gods, and Niflheim, a cold realm associated with death. This is not simply decorative mythology. It is a specific model of the cosmos, one in which the human world is one element among many in a larger structure operating according to its own principles, in which humans are not the primary objects of divine concern, but participants in something vastly larger than their own experience. Odin, the chief of the Aesir, is one of the most complex figures in any mythological tradition. He is simultaneously the god of wisdom, war, death, poetry, magic, and knowledge, a combination that seems contradictory until you understand the framework it comes from. In a tradition where existence is finite and fate is fixed, wisdom and death are not opposites. They are deeply connected. The fullest understanding of life comes from a clear-eyed relationship with its ending. The mythological stories about Odin consistently emphasize the cost of knowledge. He hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, to gain the knowledge of the runes. He gave one of his eyes to the giant Mimir in exchange for a drink from the well of wisdom beneath the world tree. He traveled through the 9 realms in disguise, gathering information about threats he could see coming but could not prevent. He was always seeking, always paying, always learning more about a fate he already knew. This Odin, the self-sacrificing seeker who pays personal cost for knowledge, was a figure that Norse culture held up as an ideal in a specific and revealing way. The highest wisdom in this tradition is not given freely. It costs something, and what it primarily teaches is that the world is moving toward its ending, and that knowing this is not the end of living, but the beginning of living fully. Thor is a very different divine figure, and the evidence of his popularity in the archaeological record, the enormous number of miniature hammer pendants found across the Norse world, indicates that he met a need that Odin's more cerebral divinity did not address. Thor was the protector, the defender of Midgard against the constant pressure of the giants, who in the Norse cosmological framework represent the forces of chaos and destruction pressing perpetually against the ordered world. He was the god you called on when the storm hit, when the harvest was at risk, when the immediate physical world needed someone to stand between it and what was coming for it. His weapon was Mjolnir, the hammer, and the miniature hammer pendants that Norse men and women wore as personal ornaments are one of the most consistent and widely distributed pieces of evidence for Norse religious identity in the archaeological record. They appear in graves, in hoards, and in domestic contexts across Scandinavia and the Norse diaspora. Some graves contain both a hammer pendant and a Christian cross, worn by the same individual, evidence of a transitional period when people navigated between two religious frameworks rather than simply trading one for the other overnight. Freya, the Vanir goddess associated with love, fertility, war, and death, represents yet another dimension of the Norse divine that does not reduce to the categories later religious traditions prefer. She is simultaneously the goddess of erotic love and of the most terrible aspects of battle. She receives half of all warriors killed in combat, taking them to her hall Folkvanger, while Odin receives the other half in Valhalla. The conjunction of love and death in a single divine figure is not accidental. It reflects a cultural understanding that the forces driving human life toward its greatest intensities are more deeply connected than a tidy theology would separate them. Valhalla is probably the most famous concept of Norse religion in popular culture, and also one of the most consistently misunderstood. The Great Hall of Odin, where warriors who died in battle were received as Einherjar, chosen fighters, is typically presented as simply a warrior's paradise, a divine reward for dying with a weapon in your hand. But the logic of Valhalla is more specific and more interesting than that. The Einherjar in Valhalla are not there to enjoy eternal rest. They are there to prepare. They fight each day, killing each other, and are restored to life each evening. They feast and build the bonds of brotherhood in the hall. They are being readied for Ragnarok. And when it comes, Odin will need every warrior he has ever gathered. Valhalla is not a retirement. It is a military academy at the end of time. Ragnarok is the concept that most distinguishes Norse theology from every other major religious tradition of the medieval world, and it deserves to be taken seriously as a philosophical position rather than catalogued as mythological curiosity. Ragnarok is the doom of the gods, the final conflict in which the forces of chaos and destruction, led by the trickster god Loki freed from his imprisonment and the giants of Jotunheim, engage the gods in a battle that ends the world. Odin is swallowed by the great wolf Fenrir. Thor kills the world serpent Jormungandr and dies from its venom. The sun is devoured. The earth sinks into the sea. The gods die. All of them. And then, in the tradition preserved in the poem Voluspa in the Elder Edda, a new world rises, renewed, cleansed, green, but the old gods are gone. Consider what it means to build a religious and cultural system around this vision. The Norse were not unique in having apocalyptic traditions. What is unusual about Ragnarok is that the apocalypse consumes the divine order along with everything else. There is no omnipotent being who survives, because omnipotence means you cannot be defeated. There is only the cycle, and the question of how to live well within it, knowing that the cycle itself has an ending. This produces a specific orientation toward existence. If nothing lasts, if even the gods are moving toward their ending, then the question of how to live is not about securing permanence. It is about the quality of action within impermanence. It is about what you do with the time the cosmos has allotted you, knowing that the cosmos itself has a limited allotment. The Norse concept of fate, embodied in the three Norns who sit at the base of Yggdrasil, weaving the threads of every being's destiny, enforces this orientation. Your fate is set. The broad outline of your story is already written. What is in your control is the specific quality of how you move through it, whether you face what is coming with courage or with cowardice, whether your deeds are worth remembering or worth forgetting. And this is why reputation, what the Norse called dam, was not vanity in this tradition. It was the closest thing to immortality the framework offered. A person whose deeds were still spoken of after their death continued to exist in the only way the tradition reliably promised. To be remembered was survival of a kind. To be forgotten was the closest thing to true annihilation that Norse cosmology contained. Go far. Do great things. Be remembered. This was not an unusual set of values. It was a deeply human one, and it shaped the Norse relationship to risk, to ambition, to the question of what a life was worth, in ways that explain the entire external record of the Viking Age more fully than any amount of historical detail can do on its own. The ritual life that accompanied these beliefs was organized around practices called blot, sacrificial feasts at which animals were offered to the gods at key points in the agricultural and cosmological calendar. The evidence for these rituals comes from archaeology, from the accounts of outside observers like Ibn Fadlan, and from Christian-era documents that preserved fragments of pre-Christian practice even as they condemned it. The runes sit at the intersection of the functional and the sacred in Norse culture. The runic alphabet, in its older form of 24 characters, and the later Viking Age form of 16, was the writing system of the Norse world, used for practical purposes including marking ownership, commemorating the dead on memorial stones, and recording information of various kinds. But the mythological account of their origin, Odin's self-sacrifice on Yggdrasil to gain their knowledge, gave them a dimension beyond the purely practical, a sacred resonance that made certain runic inscriptions more than text. The Swedish rune stones number in the thousands, the largest body of early medieval epigraphic evidence in Northern Europe. The majority were erected during the Viking Age to commemorate individuals who had gone somewhere difficult and done something worthy. They are the closest thing we have to a contemporary Norse voice speaking directly across the centuries. Stand in front of one of them, reading an inscription carved by a hand that has been underground for 1,000 years. And you are as close to the actual Norse world as a museum can take you. What they say, again and again, in slightly different words and with slightly different formulas, is that the dead person went somewhere, did something, and deserves to be remembered. The Norse mind, compressed into its most essential form, understood impermanence as the fundamental condition of existence and responded to that understanding not with despair, but with the decision to act as fully as possible within the time available, measuring the quality of a life by what it left behind. That mind is about to encounter a religion that offered a very different answer to the same questions. A religion that promised permanence. That offered not reputation, but salvation. That asked not what your deeds would be remembered as, but whether your soul would be judged worthy. How the Norse responded to that encounter is the story of how the Viking Age transformed itself from the inside out. Chapter 10. The Normans, when Vikings became the establishment. A detail survived about what happened on the riverbank at St. Clair-sur-Epte in 911 that historians have repeated for 1,000 years because it is too perfectly illustrative to leave out. As part of the formal ceremony in which the Norse leader Rollo acknowledged the nominal overlordship of the Frankish king Charles, Rollo was required to kneel and kiss the king's foot, a standard gesture of submission in the political rituals of Carolingian Francia. Rollo refused to kneel. He instructed one of his men to perform the gesture on his behalf. The man picked up the king's foot, brought it to his lips, and in doing so lifted the royal leg high enough that Charles toppled backward off his throne. Whether this happened exactly as described cannot be verified. The account comes from a later chronicle, and later, chronicles have a tendency to produce exactly the kind of memorable detail that confirms what the author wanted the audience to understand. What it accurately reflects is the true nature of the arrangement being made that day. This was not a defeated people accepting a conqueror's terms. It was a negotiation between parties of roughly equivalent power, each calculating what the agreement could give them. Charles, king of the West Franks, had reached a practical conclusion about the Norse problem in the Seine Valley. Decades of military response had failed to drive the raiders away. Every tribute payment had bought only temporary peace. The Norse were not going to be expelled. They needed to be absorbed. Rollo had his own calculation. He was not a young man in 911. He had spent decades raiding, accumulating a following, conducting an extended siege of Paris in 885 to 86. He had done what the Viking Age offered a successful leader. The question was, what came next? A territory to govern, a legitimate title, a stake in the existing order rather than a perpetual position outside it, offered something that continued raiding could not. The agreement gave Rollo and his followers the territory at the mouth of the Seine that would become Normandy, the land of the Northmen. In exchange, baptism, defense of the Seine approaches against other Norse raiders, and nominal acknowledgement of Frankish overlordship. What followed in Normandy over the next century is one of the most complete cultural assimilations in medieval history, achieved at a speed that still surprises historians who study it carefully. Within a single generation, the Norse settlers had shifted to French as their primary language. Within a few generations, Old Norse was gone from Normandy as a living spoken tongue, surviving only in place names and legal terms. The settlers intermarried with the local population. They converted to Christianity not merely nominally, but institutionally, building churches, endowing monasteries, producing bishops whose theological education and ecclesiastical behavior was indistinguishable from counterparts elsewhere in Francia. A visitor to Normandy in the early 11th century, without knowledge of its history, would have seen nothing that marked it obviously as different from any other northern Frankish territory. The language was French. The religion was Christian. The institutions were Frankish in form. And yet something had not assimilated. Not in language, not in religion, not in the visible markers of cultural identity, but in the institutional culture of the Norman ruling class, in how they organized military service, in the premium they placed on naval capability, in the territorial ambition that reproduced itself in each generation regardless of how thoroughly everything else had been transformed. The Normans of the 11th century were not Vikings. They did not think of themselves as Vikings, did not speak Norse, did not practice the old religion, but they moved through the medieval world with the same combination of military aggressiveness, geographic mobility, and adaptive intelligence that had characterized the Norse from the beginning. And they achieved things that no other people of their time and place came close to achieving. William, Duke of Normandy, was the illegitimate son of a Norman duke and a woman whose father was a tanner. His right to rule was contested from birth, and he spent the first decades of his life fighting to secure what should have been his by inheritance against Norman nobles who saw his illegitimacy as an opportunity. He was, in this biographical fact, if nothing else, very much in the tradition of the Norse younger son, the man who had no guaranteed place in the existing order and had to make one by his own capability. In October of 1066, William crossed the English Channel and defeated the English king Harold Godwinson at Hastings. What followed was not simply a change of ruling dynasty. It was the transformation of England at every level of its social, legal, and linguistic structure. The Norman French that William and his followers brought with them entered English in a flood, displacing Old English from the vocabulary of law, government, cuisine, and prestige in a process that lasted for 2 centuries and produced a language richer in synonyms than almost any other in the world. Cow and beef, pig and pork, house and mansion, ask and question. The English language became in part an archaeological record of the Norman conquest, carrying its social history in its vocabulary. But England was only the beginning. In southern Italy and Sicily, a different group of Norman adventurers was simultaneously carving out a kingdom from a territory that was Byzantine Greek, Arab Muslim, and native Italian simultaneously. The Norman presence began with small groups of knights who had traveled to Italy on pilgrimage or in search of military employment and found the chaotic political landscape full of opportunity. The most successful were the sons of a minor Norman noble named Tancred de Hauteville, whose family produced military commanders of extraordinary capability. Robert Guiscard, meaning the cunning, and his brother Roger conquered Sicily from the Arab emirs who had controlled it for 2 centuries. Completing the conquest in 1091, Roger's son, Roger II, unified the Norman holdings into the Kingdom of Sicily in 1130, a state whose cultural sophistication attracted attention across the medieval world. The Arab geographer al-Idrisi, who worked at the Norman court for years and produced one of the most sophisticated maps of the medieval world during his time there, is perhaps the most striking single example of what this kingdom represented. A Muslim scholar from North Africa, producing landmark geographic knowledge. Under the patronage of a Norman Christian king who was the great-great-grandson of Norse raiders, the Norman court of Palermo was genuinely one of the most culturally complex places in the 12th century world. Take a moment to hold that image. The Norman kingdom of Sicily was trilingual in Latin, Greek, and Arabic. Its administration drew simultaneously on Byzantine, Arab, and Norman institutional traditions. Its art and architecture blended Romanesque, Byzantine, and Islamic forms in buildings that still stand in Palermo today. Their ceilings, carved in the Islamic Muqarnas tradition, their walls covered in Byzantine mosaics of gold and colored stone. They are buildings that could only have been made at the intersection of 3 civilizations, and they were made by the descendants of Norse raiders. When Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade in 1095, the Norman response was immediate. Bohemond of Taranto, son of Robert Guiscard, led a major contingent of the crusading army, and after the capture of Antioch in 1098, established himself as its prince, founding a Norman crusader state in what is now southern Turkey and northern Syria. A Norman prince in the Middle East, a Norman king ruling a trilingual Mediterranean state, a Norman duke ruling England. All of this within 150 years of the agreement on the riverbank at St. Clair-sur-Epte. What explains it? The answers historians have proposed range from demographic pressure in Normandy, producing more ambitious young men than available land could absorb, to the specific military advantages of Norman heavy cavalry and castle building, to the effectiveness of Norman administrative institutions in governing newly conquered territories. All of these explanations have merit, but there is another element that connects the Norman achievement directly back to the Norse tradition that produced it. The Norse were, above all else, adaptable. They were not committed to a single way of doing things. They were committed to outcomes. And they were willing to change their methods, their language, their religion, and their institutional forms as completely as the situation required. The Normans were the fullest expression of that adaptability. They had shed every visible marker of their Norse identity, but they had preserved and passed on the underlying capacity, the ability to read a new environment, identify its opportunities, acquire the skills and alliances needed to exploit those opportunities, and move with speed and decision before the moment closed. That capacity does not need genes to travel. It needs institutions, practices, the specific ways that a ruling class organizes the education of its sons and the transmission of its values. The Normans passed it on through exactly those channels. And for a century and a half after the treaty on the riverbank, it expressed itself in consequences that reached from the English Channel to the coast of Syria. The Norman moment eventually passed. The kingdoms they founded were absorbed into larger structures. The Crusader states came under pressures that adaptability alone could not answer. The Norman ruling classes assimilated again, this time into the broader European aristocratic culture of the 12th century. But the world they left behind was different from the world they had found. And back in Scandinavia, the world that had produced all of this was completing its own transformation, the one that would bring the Viking Age itself to its close. Chapter 11. The End of the Viking Age, What Killed It. Harald Sigurdsson had been to places that most men in the 11th century could not have found on a map. Born in Norway around the year 1015, he fled his homeland as a teenager after fighting in the battle that killed the Norwegian king Olaf Haraldsson, a battle in which Harald was wounded and the king died. He made his way east to the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev, and from Kiev to Constantinople, where he enlisted in the Varangian guard of the Byzantine emperor. He served there for years. He fought in campaigns across the Byzantine world, in Sicily, in Bulgaria, in the Holy Land. He accumulated wealth and reputation in the service of the most sophisticated state in the Christian world, commanding units of the guard and distinguishing himself enough that Byzantine sources mention him by name, a distinction not easily earned in an institution full of exceptional soldiers. He was the kind of man the Viking Age produced at its best and most extreme. Someone for whom the horizon was not a limit, but an invitation, who had crossed enough of them to understand that there was always something on the other side. He returned to Scandinavia in the 1040s, with enough gold and enough reputation to play the game of dynastic politics at the highest level. After years of maneuvering, he became King of Norway, known by an epithet that captured his governance style with uncomfortable precision: Hardrada, the hard ruler. In the summer of 1066, at approximately 50 years of age, Harald Hardrada assembled a fleet and sailed for England. His claim to the English throne rested on a treaty interpretation that most legal historians regard as questionable. His real claim was the older and simpler one. He was the most formidable military leader in the Norse world. He had an army. He had ships. And England was there. He was met at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September by the English King Harold Godwinson, who had marched his army north from London at extraordinary speed upon learning of the invasion. The battle was decisive. Harald Hardrada was killed. His army was destroyed. The last major effort by a Scandinavian ruler to use the classic tools of Viking Age expansion to seize territory in the British Isles ended on the banks of the Derwent River in Yorkshire. 3 days later, news reached Harold Godwinson that William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast of England. Harold turned his exhausted army around and marched south. 19 days after Stamford Bridge, Harold died at Hastings. William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day of 1066. 2 invasions, 1 year, one from the last significant Viking force, embodying everything the Viking Age at its height had produced. One from the most transformed and successful descendants of the same tradition, speaking French, building castles, operating with the institutional sophistication of a medieval kingdom. The old form lost, the new form won. The conventional date for the end of the Viking Age is 1066, and Stamford Bridge is the event usually cited as the decisive moment. This is a reasonable convention, but, like all conventions, it simplifies a process that was actually gradual and structural, driven by forces that had been building for a century before Harald Hardrada sailed for England. 3 interconnected processes had been reshaping Scandinavia during the 10th and 11th centuries, and together their effect was to transform the society that had produced the raids and the longships into something fundamentally different. The first was the consolidation of political authority into centralized kingdoms. Scandinavia in the early Viking Age was not a collection of kingdoms. It was a collection of chiefdoms, regional power structures based on the personal loyalty of warriors to individual leaders, lacking the institutional infrastructure that characterized the kingdoms of Frankish and English Europe. This political fragmentation was one of the enabling conditions of the Viking Age. Independent raiding parties operated independently because there was no central authority capable of directing or controlling them. The raids were entrepreneurial because the social structure was entrepreneurial. In Denmark, Harald Bluetooth, who ruled from approximately 958 to 986, left behind the Jelling stones, 2 large runic memorial stones at the royal site of Jelling in central Jutland, on which he inscribed his claim to have unified Denmark and made the Danes Christian. Whether that unification was as complete as Harold claimed is debatable, but the direction is clear. A Scandinavian ruler was publicly claiming the identity of a unified Christian king rather than a paramount chieftain among many. His grandson, Canute, who ruled England from 1016 and Denmark from 1018 and Norway from 1028, was not a Viking Age figure in any meaningful sense. He was a medieval monarch of Scandinavian origin, governing his English kingdom through English institutions, corresponding with the Pope, undertaking pilgrimage to Rome, and presenting himself to his subjects as a legitimate Christian king in the tradition of Alfred and Athelstan. The second process was Christianization. The conversion of Scandinavia was not a single event. It was a century and a half of royal decisions, missionary activity, coercion, genuine belief, and pragmatic calculation, proceeding at different speeds in different places. Here, it is worth pausing on what the old religion actually meant to the people being asked to give it up. It was not simply a set of theological propositions that could be exchanged for better ones. It was embedded in the entire social fabric of Norse life, in the rituals that organized the agricultural year, in the understanding of fate and honor and reputation that shaped how people understood their own existence, in the specific relationship with ancestors and land and community that the blot ceremonies maintained. When a Norse chieftain accepted Christian baptism, he was not just changing his beliefs about what happened after death. He was dismantling a framework through which his entire community had understood itself for generations. The resistance to Christianization in Norway, where Olaf Haraldsson used coercion alongside persuasion to impose the new faith in the early 11th century, reflected something real about what was at stake. The Norwegian chieftains who opposed him understood that the conversion of Norway was inseparable from the centralization of royal authority. A Christian king with a literate church administration had tools of governance that a pagan chieftain system could not match. Accepting Christianity meant accepting a transformation of the political order that would reduce their own autonomy. History suggests they were right about this. Their resistance failed, and the autonomy they had been defending went with it. The third process was the closing of the geographic windows that Norse expansion had exploited. The coastal communities of England, Ireland, and Francia had spent 2 centuries learning, at enormous cost, how to defend against Norse attacks. Fortified towns, stone bridges across major rivers blocking the passage of longships, reorganized military systems capable of faster mobilization in response to coastal alerts. These developments raised the cost of raiding significantly. The soft targets of the early Viking Age had been systematically hardened. The return on investment from raiding had declined. The political consolidation of Scandinavia itself removed another enabling condition. Independent raiding parties had operated because there was no Scandinavian state capable of controlling them. As Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish kings consolidated their authority, they channeled their subjects' martial energy toward royal objectives rather than private ones. Wars of conquest between recognized kingdoms replaced freelance raiding. Long-distance trade conducted under royal protection replaced independent merchant adventuring. The Viking Age did not end because the Norse were defeated. It ended because the conditions that had produced it were transformed. The geographic windows were closing. The institutional environment had changed. The social structure that had generated independent raiders, answerable only to themselves, was being replaced by centralized kingdoms that organized human ambition differently. And in 1066, on a riverbank in Yorkshire, the last significant expression of the old form died with Harald Hardrada, a man who had carried in his single biography the entire geographic and human range of the Viking Age. From the fjords of Norway to the palaces of Constantinople to the fields of England, and who embodied at the end everything that the beginning had set in motion. 3 weeks later, on another field in southern England, the most successful descendants of the same tradition completed a conquest that would reshape the English-speaking world for centuries. The Viking Age ended not with the defeat of the Norse. It ended with their transformation into something the world they had changed would never fully recognize as their own creation. Chapter 12. The Real Legacy: What the Vikings Left Behind. Start with your mouth. If you are listening to this in English, you used Old Norse this morning before you had finished your first conversation of the day. Not as a historical curiosity, not in a specialized context, in the most ordinary, unremarkable words of everyday speech. The word they, Old Norse, the pronouns they, to them, and their are among the most frequently used words in the English language, appearing hundreds of times every day in the speech of every English speaker on earth. The original Old English pronouns that these Norse forms replaced were different words entirely. The Norse versions won out because they were used daily by the large Norse-speaking population of the Danelaw, and they were so embedded in the speech of that population that they eventually displaced the native English forms even after the two communities had merged. The word sky, Old Norse, from the Norse word for cloud. The Old English word for the visible heavens was heofon, which became heaven. The word window, Old Norse, from vindauga, meaning wind eye. The word knife, Old Norse. The Old English word for a cutting blade was CX. The word husband, Old Norse, from husbandi, meaning master of a household. The word ugly, Old Norse, from a root meaning dreadful. The word di, meaning to cease living, Old Norse. The Old English verb was stiorfan, which survives in the modern word starve, but lost its original meaning. The word egg, Old Norse. The Old English word was eig, preserved in the word yoke. The word law, Old Norse, from lag, meaning something laid down or fixed. The word wrong, Old Norse. The word anger, Old Norse. The word get, Old Norse. The word take, Old Norse. The sky you look at, the window you look through, the knife you cut with, the eggs you eat, the law you live under, all of it carrying forward. In the daily speech of hundreds of millions of people, the memory of a population that settled the northeastern half of England more than 1,000 years ago and never entirely left. Linguists who have studied Norse influence on English estimate that somewhere between 500 and 1,000 commonly used English words have direct Old Norse origins, though the precise figure depends on how you define both direct and common. And scholars have debated the methodology. What is not debated is that the influence is real, extensive, and woven into the deepest layers of the language rather than sitting on the surface as specialized borrowing. The place name evidence maps the Norse world onto the physical landscape of Britain with extraordinary precision. The suffix by, meaning settlement or village in Old Norse, appears in the names of more than 200 English towns and villages: Derby, Grimsby, Whitby, Selby, Rugby, Formby. Each name is a linguistic fossil from the Viking Age, preserving in the modern map the memory of a Norse-speaking community established more than 1,000 years ago. The suffix thorp, meaning an outlying farm or secondary settlement, appears in dozens of English place names concentrated in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Thwaite, meaning a piece of cleared ground, is distributed across the Lake District. The Old Norse word gate, meaning a street or path, survives in the street names of York, where Gudramgate and Gillygate and Micklegate preserve the bones of the Norse city of Jorvik that stood there for nearly a century. In Ireland, the major coastal cities carry their Norse origins in their names. Waterford comes from the Old Norse Vadrefjord, Wexford from Waysfjord, Limerick from Hlimrekker. These are not distant etymological connections. They are direct evidence that Norse speakers named these places and that the names were permanent enough to survive everything that came after. Now, step back for a moment from the accumulation of evidence. Think about what it means at a human level. When a person in Grimsby or Whitby gives their address today, they are using a word that a Norse settler coined to describe a new home in a foreign land more than 1,000 years ago. The name outlasted the settler. It outlasted the language the settler spoke. It is still in daily use by people who have no idea where it came from. That is how deep the roots went. In Russia and Ukraine, the Norse legacy is embedded in the name of the country itself. Russia derives from Rus, the name for the Norse traders whose presence along the eastern river systems established the political framework from which the Russian state emerged. According to the most widely accepted scholarly view, the Rurikid dynasty, founded by the Norse leader Rurik and his descendants, ruled in Russian principalities from the 9th century until 1598, a span of more than 700 years. The genetic evidence has been significantly advanced by a major study published in the journal Nature in September of 2020, led by a team including Eski Willerslev at the University of Cambridge, which analyzed ancient DNA from more than 440 Viking Age burials across Europe, Greenland, and North America. The study produced findings that complicated the popular image of the Vikings in several important ways. The genetic analysis showed that people buried with Viking Age grave goods were considerably more diverse in their ancestry than the popular image suggests. Individuals with ancestry from southern Europe, from the British Isles, and from Central Asia were found in Scandinavian burial contexts, reflecting a Norse world that was, from its beginning, a world of movement and mixture rather than genetic isolation. The study also found that individuals identified as Norse in burial contexts from Scotland, Ireland, and elsewhere often had significant local ancestry alongside Scandinavian ancestry, confirming that Norse settlers integrated with local populations rather than simply displacing them. The researchers were careful to note that genetic ancestry and cultural identity do not map onto each other in simple ways. The Viking Age produced a genuine mixing of populations across an extraordinary geographic range, and its genetic legacy in the modern world is distributed through the diverse populations that carry it, rather than concentrated in any identifiable group. The legal legacy is less visible than the linguistic and genetic evidence, but runs deep in the institutions of the countries that inherited it. The Thing assembly system, the Norse practice of gathering free men to hear cases, recite law, and adjudicate disputes through public process, influenced the development of legal institutions across territories where Norse settlers established a significant presence. The precise degree to which Norse legal tradition contributed to the development of English common law is debated by legal historians, who differ on how directly the Danelaw's legal customs influenced the system that eventually emerged. What is not disputed is that the areas of the Danelaw maintained their own legal customs for generations after the end of Norse political authority, and that those customs left traces in the hybrid legal tradition that followed. In Iceland, the continuity is direct and unambiguous. The Althing, established in 930, survives today as the Parliament of Iceland, one of the oldest continuously operating parliamentary institutions in the world by most measures of that distinction. It still meets in Reykjavik. It still bears the name the Norse settlers gave it. The thread of institutional identity, connecting the Assembly of 930 to the functioning democracy of the 21st century, is 1,000 years long and unbroken. The economic legacy runs through the commercial geography of Northern Europe in ways that have been absorbed so thoroughly into the normal landscape of trade that they are easy to overlook. The Norse trading towns of the Viking Age established commercial nodes in the Northern European network that subsequent medieval development either built on directly or oriented itself in relation to. The walrus ivory trade is a specific example that recent research has made visible in unexpected ways. Walrus ivory from the Arctic was one of the most valuable luxury materials in medieval Europe, used for carved religious objects, game pieces, and decorative items. The Norse Greenland community sustained itself economically for centuries, partly by hunting walrus and exporting their ivory to European markets. Isotopic analysis of medieval ivory objects in European museum collections has shown that a significant proportion of medieval European ivory came from Greenlandic walrus tusks. A carved ivory chess piece in a museum in Paris or London may have begun its existence as a walrus tusk on the coast of Greenland, processed by hands that have been under the ground for 700 years. The object survived. The people who made it are gone, but the distance their work traveled, from the edge of the habitable world to the display cases of the great museums, is itself a measure of how far the Norse commercial network actually reached. The saga tradition is itself a form of legacy that deserves acknowledgement on its own terms. The Icelandic sagas are one of the most remarkable bodies of literature produced in the medieval world. Complex and psychologically acute narratives about human choice, obligation, and the consequences of action, told with a restraint and irony that continues to attract readers and scholars centuries after their composition. They are not simply sources for historians. They are literature. And they are the product of a community whose existence traces directly back to the Norse settlers who crossed the North Atlantic in the 9th century and built a society in an empty island at the edge of the known world. Now, step back from the specific legacies and return to the question that has been running through this entire story. Were the Vikings barbarians? Or were they the most adaptable people of the medieval world? The honest answer is that the question contains an assumption worth examining. Barbarian is not a neutral description. It is a label applied by one group to another to mark a relationship of superiority and inferiority. And the history of that label is almost always more revealing about the people applying it than about the people receiving it. The monks who called the Norse barbarians were describing, from inside the experience of being raided, men who had no regard for the things the monks valued most. That description is emotionally true. It is not comprehensively true. The Norse were violent. The raids were real. The suffering of the communities they attacked was real and should not be diminished by anything else in this story. The Norse were also builders of cities, writers of literature, developers of legal institutions, long-distance traders, open ocean navigators, founders of states, and producers of objects of extraordinary craft that are still being studied and admired 12 centuries after they were made. They enslaved people and built one of the oldest parliamentary traditions in the world. They burned monasteries and wrote sagas that are still being read. They raided and traded and settled and assimilated and transformed and disappeared into the peoples they had changed. That complexity is not a contradiction. It is what a civilization looks like when you examine it honestly, rather than through the selective lens of legend or condemnation or romanticization. The adaptability that allowed the Norse to operate across such an extraordinary range of environments and contexts was real and remarkable. No other people of the early medieval period maintained the flexibility to be traders in one context, raiders in another, settlers in a third, and founders of states in a fourth, across a geographic range stretching from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. That adaptability did not disappear when the Viking Age ended. It transformed into Norman ambition in England and Sicily, into Icelandic literary culture, into the legal traditions of the Danelaw and the parliamentary tradition of the Althing, into the linguistic substrate of English, into the cultural and genetic fabric of populations across an enormous swath of the Northern Hemisphere. The Viking Age left the world different from what it had found. The question of exactly how different is one that historians will keep arguing about. But the arguing itself, the careful, evidence-driven argument about what happened and why it mattered, is perhaps the most appropriate tribute to a people who understood that the only things genuinely worth doing are the things still worth talking about long after the doing is finished. Chapter 13. Epilogue, The Viking Inside Modernity. There is a building in Reykjavik, Iceland, where something has been happening without interruption for more than 1,000 years. Not a museum, not a monument, a working parliament, where elected representatives debate legislation, pass budgets, hold ministers to account, and conduct the daily business of democratic governance for a country of 370,000 people. The building is modern. The institution inside it is not. It is called the Althing, and it has been meeting, in one form or another, since the year 930, when Norse settlers gathered at a place called Thingvellir and invented a way of governing themselves that did not require a king. Both things came from the same tradition. Both things are real, and that fact alone should give pause to anyone who wants to summarize the Viking Age in a single image. Go to Thingvellir now, and you are standing in a national park that Iceland has protected as a place of particular significance. The Rift Valley, where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are slowly pulling apart, is also the valley where the Norse settlers of Iceland held their annual assembly for centuries. The Law Rock, where the law speaker stood to recite the legal code of the community from memory, is still there. The landscape has changed little from what the settlers of the 10th century would have recognized. Standing at Thingvellir on a clear Icelandic morning, with the rift stretching ahead of you and the mountains in the distance between the present moment and the historical past collapses into something almost tangible. You are standing where they stood. The ground is the same ground. Lons au Meadows has a similar quality of compressed time. The reconstructed longhouses on the northern tip of Newfoundland sit in a landscape of bog and sea, an enormous sky that would be instantly recognizable to the people who built the originals 1,000 years ago. The distance to Greenland from this headland is less than 300 kilometers. Looking northwest across the Strait of Belle Isle on a clear day, you are looking in the direction the ships came from. You are looking at the water they crossed. The Norse reached this place around the year 1000. They built their camp, repaired their ships, explored a coastline, and left. They left so completely that for nearly 960 years, the only trace of their presence was a set of grass-covered mounds that a fisherman knew about and a Norwegian with the right question asked about. They were here. The ground remembers, even when the history books forgot. Every day, in the ordinary speech of hundreds of millions of people, Old Norse is being spoken without anyone knowing it. Every time someone looks out a window, every time someone trusts a friend, every time someone feels anger or describes the sky or reaches for a knife, the language carries forward something from a culture that formally ended 1,000 years ago. Language is the deepest archive. It preserves what everything else loses. Think about what it means that the word they is Old Norse, not a specialist term, not a borrowed word for a new concept, but the simplest possible way of referring to other people in the English language. Every conversation about anyone other than the speaker and the listener uses a word that came from the Danelaw. Every story told in English about anyone other than the teller uses it. The Norse are in every sentence. They never left. The research published in Nature in 2020 that traced Viking Age ancestry across the modern populations of Europe found something that captures this distributed legacy precisely. The Norse did not leave a concentrated genetic mark on a single identifiable population. They left a dispersed one, spread across the diverse communities that carry it, absorbed into the ordinary variation of human populations across an enormous geographic range. Their biological contribution to the modern world is everywhere and nowhere, invisible and present simultaneously. The Viking Age, in popular culture, the television series and the films and the games and the endless stream of documentaries, reflects something real about what this period in history continues to offer. There is a persistent human fascination with the image of people who looked at a horizon and decided to find out what was on the other side. Who built the technology to get there? Who went anyway? That fascination is not nostalgia. It is recognition. Something in us responds to the combination of capability and courage and willingness to sail into the unknown. Because something in us still wants to believe that the horizon is not a wall but a beginning. That image is real. It is also incomplete. The full story includes the people on the receiving end of the ships, the communities that were raided, the individuals who were enslaved, the cultures that were disrupted and in some cases destroyed. The Viking Age was not a clean adventure. No period of genuine historical consequence ever is. The full story requires holding the Oseberg ship and the Lindisfarne raid in the same frame, the Icelandic saga and the slave trade, the Althing and the coerced conversion, the Lance Ox Meadows camp and the conflicts with the people who were already there, the Varangian Guard and the rivers of blood the great heathen army left across England. That is the Viking Age in full, a civilization of genuine complexity, genuine achievement, genuine brutality, and genuinely extraordinary range that left traces still visible in the language, the law, the geography, and the genetics of the modern world. We started this story with a world that most people in the year 700 could not have imagined would produce anything remarkable. A cold peninsula at the edge of the known world, fragmented and invisible, overlooked by every civilization that was busy being consequential elsewhere. 3 centuries later, that peninsula had sent its people to every direction the medieval world offered, and some it had not yet mapped. They had raided and traded and settled and built and converted and transformed and been transformed in return. They had left their language in English mouths, their institutional memory in functioning parliaments, their ships in museum halls, and their stories in books that people still read because the questions those stories ask have not yet been answered. The words are still in your mouth. The ground at Thingvellir is still the same ground. And somewhere under the grass of Newfoundland, if you know where to look, the outline of a longhouse is still there, quiet and patient, waiting for the next person with the right question